Good evening. I'm Justin Chang, film critic for the Los Angeles Times, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to week 7 and week 8 of the Ultimate Summer Movie Showdown, the LA Times series where our readers choose the greatest summer movies of all time, or at least since 1975, the summer of a little movie called Jaws. With theaters closed and major Hollywood releases being held back due to the COVID-19 pandemic, my Times colleagues and I asked ourselves, what if instead of having the worst summer movie season ever, we engaged with our readers and came up with the ultimate summer movie season? This is how it works. Each week for 16 weeks, we're compiling some of those best or most memorable movies from each week of release since 1975, and we're letting all of you vote for your favorites in a series of head-to-head contests posted on my Twitter account at Justin C. Chang. You all have been voting for 8 weeks now, which means that we are officially at the halfway mark of this 16-week showdown. Yay! And so it is time for a quick recap of our first 8 winners. And I think you've picked an excellent slate so far. Our winners are The Avengers, Bridesmaids, Mad Max Fury Road, Alien, Finding Nemo, Jurassic Park. And the 2 winners we'll be talking about tonight, Raiders of the Lost Ark and Jaws. The last 3 weeks have, of course, been a Steven Spielberg triple crown, and it is only fitting since he did direct Jaws, the movie that changed Hollywood, and beach-going and summer movie-going as we know it. I can't think of a better movie to talk about as we go into this 4th of July weekend. And we could spend a lot of time talking about the difficult making of Jaws, from the numerous script changes to the malfunctioning prop shark, but what emerged from that challenging shoot was and is a masterpiece of horror, action, and comedy that immediately vaulted Spielberg into the front ranks of commercial filmmakers. Based on a novel by Peter Benchley, who co-wrote the script with Carl Gottlieb, Spielberg's brilliant thriller about a shark terrorizing tourists and residents of a summer resort town starred Roy Scheider, Robert Shaw, and Richard Dreyfuss. It opened in theaters June 20th, 1975, 45 years ago, and was given a wide release, a relatively new distribution strategy at the time that quickly set the template for innumerable blockbusters to come. Adjusted for inflation, I believe the movie has grossed about $2 billion, give or take a few, worldwide. It is still making money, having returned to drive-in theaters just last month. It received an Academy Award nomination for Best Picture, and it won Oscars for Best Sound Mixing, Best Film Editing for the great Verna Fields, and of course, Best Original Score for the great John Williams. And on to our next movie quickly. A few years after Jaws, Spielberg directed a movie that was originally marketed as Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, but has, of course, now commonly become known as just Raiders of the Lost Ark. The movie, written by Lawrence Kasdan from a story by George Lucas and Philip Kaufman, introduced Harrison Ford in one of his signature roles. It also starred Karen Allen, Paul Freeman, and John Rhys-Davies in a deliriously entertaining, desert-digging, Nazi-thwarting adventure. It was the first, and still is, by common consensus, the finest movie in the Indiana Jones series. It opened in theaters June 12th, 1981, and has grossed, I believe, $390 million worldwide, both from its initial theatrical run and subsequent re-releases. And it won 5 Oscars for Best Art Direction, Best Sound, Best Film Editing, Best Visual Effects, and Special Achievement for Sound Effects Editing. It was also Oscar nominated for Best Picture, Best Director Steven Spielberg, Best Cinematography, and Best Original Score. That is a lot of movie to talk about tonight. And while I wish I could tell you that Mr. Spielberg were our special guest, he unfortunately could not be here with us. We did get the next best thing. So without further ado, I am pleased to be joined tonight by 2 of my movie-loving LA Times colleagues, Mary McNamara, the Pulitzer Prize-winning culture critic and columnist for the Times, and Mark Olson, film reporter and film critic for the Times. Mary and Mark, welcome to the Ultimate Summer Movie Showdown. Thank you so much for joining me here. Mary, you've been on the Showdown before. Mark, this is your first time, so welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
We're excited. I should have worn like my shark hat or something, like one of the Shark Week things.
I wish I had the mayor from Amity. I wish I had his anchor jacket.
He does have a very distinctive jacket and tie, I believe. I mean, quickly, just how are you guys doing? I mean, I'm excited to dive into these movies with you. I know we've seen each other on camera in occasional meetings and things, but how is life treating you? however many weeks we are
Good.
into this
We're
pandemic.
good.
Yeah.
Still here. Still well. My house is full of kids. So, the door is locked right now. So that's good.
Yeah, myself and everyone in my family have been healthy so far, so I'm just grateful for that. And I keep saying this, I can't figure out if it's that the days go fast and the weeks are long, or it's the other way around. I feel like time is both like fast and slow all at once.
For sure. I think we all feel some of that, just the temporal dislocation from reality that this experience has been. And I think it's we should definitely start with Jaws. It's going to be a very Jaws-centric conversation because this is a kind of disaster movie. And Mary, you wrote very perceptively as always about this, and we'll get to that in a second. The resonance of Jaws in this present moment, but let's go back to the first time both of you saw this movie. Mary, I know you.
Okay.
When was the first time you saw Jaws? And I know you saw in theaters.
I don't think you guys are. That I saw it in the theaters, and I was like 11. I don't know what my parents were thinking, except for that there hadn't been a movie like this before. So they were thinking, oh, well, it's a shark movie, whatever. What could it be? So I am officially of the generation that does not swim in the ocean because of Jaws still to this day. And I still remember how terrifying it was. And when Quint died, that image is like just blazoned in my brain, even though I've seen the movie a million times since. And like, you can look at it now and go, yeah, that was obviously a robot shark. When first seeing it, most terrifying thing I'd ever seen in my life. The music, most terrifying thing I'd ever heard in my life. I came home from that movie and I remember I wouldn't take a bath. Like, I was convinced that a great white shark was going to come through the faucet. Like, that seemed very reasonable to me. So it had a huge impact on my life. And it wasn't until, much later that I was able to appreciate that, first of all, it was, the first like kind of horror disaster summer movie, but also it's such a damn good movie. Like, you don't even really need the shark in the end. I mean, it's a great shark, don't get me wrong, and it does scare the living crap out of you, but it's like the characters and the writing and just the whole, the construct of the narrative. It's a terrific movie. Like, you can't really categorize it as a scary movie. It's just a terrific movie.
It really is. And Mark, was your experience with it as terrifying as Mary's? When did you first see this?
I did not see it in theaters. I don't really remember the first time I saw it. I mean, it's the kind of movie, I think in part because of the music, it's just always kind of been like in my sort of cultural consciousness. I mean, I remember there was like a parody of it in Caddyshack, that there's a pool joke. But I mean, to me, my like earliest sort of Jaws memory is we took a family trip to California, the first time I ever came to California, and went to is it the Universal Studios tour where they had you're on the tram and the shark jumps out of the water at you, and that was so thrilling and so terrifying. So in a lot of ways, my like personal like earliest Jaws memory is the theme park attraction more so than the movie itself, which has just kind of always been a part of like my sort of like cultural consciousness.
Mark, you just jogged a memory for me because that was my first exposure to any Jaws culture myself, was being on that tram ride. And I remember just that mechanical shark lunging out of the water was the scariest thing that ever happened to me. I think I was 4 or 5. And I'll go ahead and answer my own question too, because it was, I waited a long time to watch this movie, in part because my mom had seen it in theaters and she told me how scary it was. And so I did not muster up the courage to see Jaws until I think I was a teenager. And I think, my reaction is very much Mary's as well. I still find it terrifying. I have to say, of all the winners we've had in this excellent series so far, this was the movie I was actually dreading rewatching, even though I've seen it many times. What you said, Mary, the Quint scene, I watched it just this morning, and my 3-year-old like walked in just as he was like spitting up blood too. So that was like perfect. I had to pause. I never launched in front
of the screen.
It was like, I have never lunged for the remote so fast. It's like, I thought you were asleep still. And it's true. I mean, as sort of rudimentary as maybe the technology still is, that scene is so convincing still,
Well,
and just it's the most
I mean,
horrifying
I
thing.
can't, as somebody who actually is old enough to remember life before Jaws, and it's the same with Star Wars. It's like there was nothing to prepare us for this movie, so my parents sent me with my friends to the Carroll Theater with popcorn money without a thought that, it's a movie. How bad could it be? And it's just like everything about it, the when the girl is swimming and she starts doing this and she starts doing that, and then her remains wash up on the beach, the kid and his rubber raft that we all had. I mean, I grew up on the East Coast. We all went to the ocean. We all had those damn rubber rafts. It was just like you were open mouthed and in this state of like just constant fear, but also just like bewilderment. Like, what is going on in this movie? And I remember also when the head comes through the bottom of the boat, just screaming. And that may have been the first time that I like screamed and jumped up in my seat. And it was, and adults were doing it. That's what was so, it wasn't just the kids that were screaming. There were full grown men screaming out loud in the Carroll Theater at Jaws. I'd never seen anything like it in my life. Still haven't. That was like, anyway. I sound like such a geezer. Sorry.
No, I love hearing all this.
I have to understand that we didn't have color movies.
Mary, it's like you're giving your own version of the Robert Shaw monologue, except you're talking about.
Exactly. Let's start comparing scars.
I think that context is really great and valuable because you read like making of accounts of Jaws, you watch making of documentaries, and they're always like, people were like, oh, this is a really great idea for a movie. And it's interesting to look back now, 45 years later, when it feels like Hollywood has basically colonized every kind of disaster, every kind of threat or menace under the sun. We have Shark Week, we have Sharknado, we have Crawl about, alligators. It's like there's nothing up for grabs anymore. Right. And so there's almost like it feels like a reminder of a purer time when you can imagine the impact that this movie had. And it's just the movie is often presented as this. It's what you were saying about how it doesn't even need a shark in some ways, because, and of course that was because the shark was malfunctioning a lot. Just the logistics of making the film were so difficult. And so to me, the movie is still such a great lesson about, invention by necessity, and how much better the movie became because Spielberg had to be very restrained in terms of how he showed it. So yeah, do you think that's a big reason why it still holds up?
Well, I think it's that the simplicity of it is a lot of what makes the movie so affecting and has made it so lasting. I mean, it's interesting, I think, going back and reading things about the movie. Just this week, the critic Manohla Dargis in the New York Times published something about Jaws, where she spoke about it as essentially like an allegory of environmental collapse, and sort of like the nature getting its revenge back on humans. So many other people have written about it as a sort of a Watergate era film, or a sort of like institutional film, maybe a post-Vietnam film. Like I think the simplicity of the movie itself, because of the shark issues, have made it such a durable and sort of malleable object that the movie can be so many different things for different people at different times.
I also think, and I don't, I haven't been a scholar of the making of the movie. I do know that the shark, they called it Bruce, right? Like it kept breaking down. And I think that was all to the good, because of course, as we all know with horror, if you show the monster too often, it becomes less of a monster. And I feel like in Jaws, there was the perfect kind of dread. And of course, obviously it being a shark, the fin was, just spectacular in terms of prompting, it's here, but you can't see it. But also, like, the first time you see the size of it, it's just like the most, horrifying thing. But it is a quest movie. And it's also, there's the denial of the town that there's something wrong that could stand in for everything. And that I recently wrote about as being, the mayor, of Amity being our president saying, "Oh, there's no problem, open the beaches." We have just gone through a literal open the beaches, keep the beaches open moment. Um, and then, three men on a journey to conquer something that's so enormous that you can't even, that they didn't even know it existed before this moment. And that can sort of, you can fill anything in there. It is, it's an epic quest kind of movie.
Well, Mary, as you point out in the piece that you wrote, the fact that Lee Fierro, the actress who plays the sort of grieving mother who comes up and slaps Roy Scheider's character, over the fact that he didn't close the beaches, the fact that that woman in particular just died from COVID-19, it's unbelievable that is what happened to her.
It is a huge and horrifying irony, because she did a great job. She was a local, if I understand correctly, if I remember correctly, having written about her. But it was just such a smart move to put that scene in, because it really humanized, this idea of like, oh, people were dying, and the first girl who dies, we don't really know who she is, except for, she's some floozy who jumps in the water with a boy, which we all know they're the first to die in every disaster movie. And then, we see the kid, but we don't know who the kid is. But her moment with Brody really brings home that this isn't just like, oh my God, it's a monster, we're all so scared. Like, these people, it's killing people, and the people matter. And I think that is something, that when we're in the middle of a pandemic and the numbers come and the charts come and whatever, that it's really important for us to remember that every single point on that chart is a person who many people loved and depended on and miss. And that was that moment in Jaws. And so for her to die of COVID, it's just like, oh my God, is the universe trying to tell us something? Yes.
Yeah. Also, I think
don't open the beaches.
I think in the movie that moment does such a great job for the Roy Scheider character as well, for Brody, that it's sort of like it brings this home to him in a way. I mean, his son had been sort of almost, attacked by the shark, and so that had really sort of awakened him. But I think there was something about just the simple plea of that grieving mother that really sort of sent him on this quest that sort of at last put him on the side of the people, as opposed to sort of like doing the bidding of the mayor and the sort of town leaders.
And that moment, like, sort of set up what would become a template for most disaster movies. There's always the sort of scheming guy who, when building the huge skyscraper, tried to get the cheaper rivets or whatever, which is why it's on fire now. Or, the person who's not listening to the seismologist, or the person, it's sort of like set up this kind of character where, yes, it's a disaster movie, but it's a disaster that could have been averted. And I think that that's an important lesson in all of, the disaster movies that sort of followed Jaws. There's a lesson, which is like, yes, there are forces in the universe that are greater than us that we do not control, but there are ways that we can control our risk from them. Which is something that you would think we would have learned by now. But clearly, given the state of, our country and the pandemic, we haven't learned the lessons from our own favorite movies. So that's on us.
This is all so true. And just that notion of just criminal negligence often being the villain more so than the shark even. And Jaws is very much a movie about information and knowledge, and who has that information and what do they do with it. And I have a really quick tangent. Mary, what you were just saying just now took me back 2 years to a movie that was made 2 years before Jaws, which is The Exorcist, in a very different way, but structurally it kind of mirrors it too, because the threat is not, it's almost like the threat is not really the devil. The threat is not really the shark. It is acknowledging that these things are threats. And with the devil, of course, we can have more of a debate about, because it's a religious movie, and The Exorcist is a great religious film as well as a great horror film. But so much of the struggle is about just getting the characters to agree that something needs to be done. And right. Yeah, it's still, I think that's it's funny too, Mark.
Saying there's a problem aren't crazy.
Absolutely. Mark, you were saying about just all the different, just interpretive prisms we can bring to it. And I was just reading, and I didn't know if this was common knowledge, but Castro was apparently a big fan of Jaws because he had a very Marxist interpretation of the movie, of course, because it's one in which, similar to what we were talking about, the shark is not just a physical threat, but becomes an economic one. And so you see how the entwining of the commerce of the town with the governance of the town, it just, there's so much grist for just as an economic allegory as well. Mary, I really want to quickly, you mentioned that you have read Peter Benchley's best-selling novel, or you read it after the movie. I have not read the book. Can you tell us about the book, and do you agree with the general perception about that this is one of those rare cases where the movie is much better than the book?
Well, having seen the movie before I read the book, and having, obviously had such a huge reaction to it, yes, I think, it's definitely, tighter and more exciting. In the book, I remember that, like, the characters between the Brody and Hopper characters, they were on land together. There was like a bigger relationship. If I'm remembering correctly, Hopper actually had an affair with Brody's wife. So there was just like this whole other, much more personal interplay going on. I can't remember much more than that, but I do, we were all thrilled because I was 11. We were thrilled because there was a sex scene, very exciting, and also because the book had a nearly naked woman on it, and then the shark. That was very exciting. But I think it ended differently. It ends with the shark. He's dead, but he just kind of spirals down, and Brody sticks his face, and I hope I'm not wrong because it has been a long time, sticks in his face in the water and sort of watches this big shape just sort of, and it's a much more like, it could still be alive, but in obviously I think that the way that they ended the movie was much more, not just theatrically more dramatic, but also, that sucker's dead. It's like, that's not coming back. So that was good. And also, I think Hopper dies in the book, if I'm remembering correctly, and he survives.
Hooper
in
dies
that whole thing where he goes down in the cage or whatever. I think he gets killed, and Brody's the only one left at the end, if I'm remembering correctly. So I'm sure we'll be hearing from Jaws novel aficionados if I'm not.
The Jaws Society.
But it wasn't like, oh, I wish they'd put this in, or I wish they blah, blah. You were just like, okay, yeah. The movie's better. And also the chemistry of the cast was so good. Oh my God. It was just amazing.
It really is. That central trio of Shaw and Scheider and Dreyfuss and Lorraine Gary as, in perhaps the kind of prototypical supporting wife role, but she really, makes, and I think Spielberg does as much with those kinds of characters as he can, because his movies are so much about family. But yeah.
Well, I think the structure of the movie is so interesting because it's like the first base, like half of it when you're in the town, and there's a lot of characters, and then the second half, once it's just those three men on a boat, the movie just streamlines and just kind of really strips itself down. It becomes so much more elemental, leading to what I know is a scene that you two really like, where that sort of like drunken evening where the three of them are together. Robert Shaw tells his big story. Like, it's interesting to me the way that the movie plays in such two clean halves, but then also the whole movie's just like stripping itself down that way.
It's true, and I gather that it was actually the second half of the novel that most appealed to Spielberg in terms of like, this is what I want to make a movie about, and this is where, of course, the Moby Dick resonance of Jaws very much, that truly just manhunting this shark. There is something elemental about that, but I think that first half, you get so much of what Spielberg is good at also, and not just the streamlined adventure and suspense of the second half, but just he's so good at evoking community, just the joys of living in a small town. There is, if there weren't a giant great white shark on the loose, of course, is the kind of town where you would want to spend a summer. And I think he just nails all of that so well. And Mark, since you mentioned the famous monologue, it's worth noting just that in itself, that scene is kind of a masterpiece a miniature masterpiece in itself. And it took a lot of work to get that scene pared down. It was, many writers worked on it. John Milius, Howard Sackler, and Robert Shaw himself, who delivers the monologue, had a hand in writing it. I think it was something like 10 pages originally. And so, and then whittled it down to that, very, very concise yet very evocative speech. It's funny because, this is a movie, we've been talking about this, where the shark is all the more terrifying for not being seen, and we learn to associate it with just, oh, it's a fin approaching. Oh, it's John Williams's score, which evokes almost the pulse of a shark or the heartbeat of a shark, and you learn to identify. The movie is constantly signaling the shark's presence rather than showing it. And to me, the monologue kind of works in a similar way because you see, when he's describing, how the thousands of men who go into the water and are slowly, picked apart by these sharks that are circling, and it is just horrifying. And you don't see anything. Of course, it's purely just the brilliance of Shaw's performance and the evocative quality of the writing. So yeah, I mean, I just love that scene. And to me, the movie it definitely does deliver on the in terms of gore, in terms of carnage, in terms of the visceral satisfactions. But I think that it's so artful when it's showing you so very little.
Yeah. Well, I love that scene because it kind of starts out funny, where in the thing, She Broke My Heart, they're showing off their scars, they're a little drunk. And, you're having these three guys also, and it is very much of the time, these kind of three different views of masculinity, because there's a tension between the Richard Dreyfuss character and the Robert Shaw character, because he's, kind of a geek, and he's like, he knows about sharks from reading about them and learning, seeing them in aquariums, studying them. And Robert Shaw is, this big, from a different era, and he's, all about killing them, and he doesn't need a bigger boat, and he doesn't want the equipment. In fact, destroys the equipment at one point because he's going to just harpoon this guy with his knife or whatever. And Brody's somewhere in the middle. But that scene, which I think they had to, didn't John Milius write that? They were trying to find a way to sort of pin down the Robert Shaw, the Quint's character, so that you sort of understood him more, and he, remembered that this had happened on the Indianapolis, and so use that as the story. And that was just, it just takes your breath away every single time. And the delivery is amazing, and also the reaction of the two other men, which is kind of like, holy shit, we were kind of making fun of him because he's a little weird, but yeah, if you live through something like that, you will not be a normal person after that. And his huge animosity towards wanting to basically kill this shark with his bare hands is completely explained. It was brilliant. And it sounds like it was a really messy shoot, but they got there in the end, which is a lesson for us all.
Well, and it also just, I think it makes his death all the more tragic as well as terrifying. It's like he's been, he's a sailor, and so and he's the one with all the know-how, and yet he is the one of them who dies and is eaten in just that spectacularly awful scene. It's funny, yeah, and the logistics and everything. I think of this as a movie that was very much made on the fly, and there was an actors' strike looming in '73 or '74 when it was, and Spielberg had to work very quickly, and there were just script being constantly written in kind of bits and pieces, almost in a way that makes you think of the legendary stories about the making of something like Casablanca, where just things change, circumstances changing rapidly under very tight pressurized circumstances, and the result is a masterpiece. And Spielberg was 27 when he directed this movie. It kind of, he'd made Duel, he'd made Sugarland Express. It kind of boggles the mind. And just speaking of just filmmaking, distribution, Mark, I wanted to ask you, this movie is often credited with being a test case for the wide release strategy that has now, of course, become very typical of all Hollywood blockbusters, although it's worth noting that was considered a wide release in '75 was 450 screens, which was pretty puny compared to a wide release today. Jaws and Star Wars from this era are often credited with the ascendancy of the wide release commercial juggernaut. And so for a lot of critics, they are often synonymous with the death of American cinema, especially following the great creative renaissance of the 70s and New Hollywood. Just what do you know a lot about this era? What do you make of that? And do these movies signify the death of American cinema to you, or something else, or is it a kind of rebirth? You know, and I know this debate has been had to death, but
yeah, no, I mean, to me, they are not the death of American cinema. I mean, I think because the one of the things about American cinema is its ability to kind of reinvent itself, and so while a certain kind of movie had flowered, you know, after Easy Rider, when you know the studios were making these sort of like countercultural movies, the sort of youth movies, and then what we now think of as sort of like that golden renaissance of sort of flaky 70s movies. I don't think these movies are what killed those things off. I mean, you just as easily could, you know, pinpoint the end of that era to say like Heaven's Gate, which comes a couple of years later. I think that you know, and both Spielberg and George Lucas are filmmakers that part of what makes them so enduring is it's it's funny they both are so easy to dismiss. I think Spielberg in particular is a filmmaker where he is just so good. He's such a skilled craftsman, and he has something so just innate about him as a filmmaker that you kind of do in like a cool contrarian way want to like dismiss him, but he is just sort of too good. You kind of just can't deny the just skill and craftsmanship of his works. And while you know, like personally, I find him to be too much of an optimist through a lot of his career, although in like some of his more recent films, you know, like Munich or Lincoln, that I think there has been sort of like a darkness that's come in. That so I think even he is someone who's been evolving as he gets older and over the course of his career. So I think it's easy to want to pinpoint, you know, Jaws and Star Wars as like the death of something or to kind of make them into these punching bags. But I think that like A denies what's great about those movies, and B sort of discounts the sort of larger, you know, cultural moment that they both were coming out of. What do you think?
yeah, I mean, this is you kind of answered a question before I had it, which is basically just kind of what is your relationship to Spielberg as a director? And he's directed so many movies in so many different genres and just themes. You know, he is someone who is thought of as being very much in touch with his inner child, and yet you know, and then you have the argument of the sort of the grown-up Spielberg that we have now. Although I would say he's still very much in touch with both sides, and in fact sometimes blurs the two. Um, I agree with you. I feel that he is just his innate skill as a technician, as a masterful technician, and just a masterful manipulator of emotion. In some ways, is you know his best and maybe his worst quality. It almost feels sometimes as though he doesn't have to work as hard to elicit just a reaction or a sensation. I mean, his command over your emotions and just over even just the way you breathe is just so. Sometimes you can tell maybe when he's phoning it in, but when he's really, you know, when he's truly committed himself to something, it just, you know, there's really no beating him in some ways. And it's funny. I wanted to ask you, where does Jaws fall for you? I guess the simple question is, do you have a favorite Spielberg movie? And for a while, I used to say that Jaws was it. And having rewatched it again fairly recently, I think it's still very much up there. But where does it fall? Where does Jaws fall for you? And do you have a movie of his that means something particularly special to you? It doesn't necessarily have to be his best, just the one that you like.
I mean, it's funny. I think the one that I have the deepest kind of emotional connection to is actually Raiders of the Lost Ark. Like I did see that in a theater as a child, and like really, there was something just so joyful about that movie, and that I still it's funny. I watched the first three of the Indiana Jones movies kind of at the beginning of quarantine. I don't really know why, and they still like held just so much joy, and they just kind of made me so happy. So I have, I think, deepest emotional connection to the Raiders movies. Although I have a very strange, I have a deep and personal relationship to E.T., but it's complicated because like I saw E.T. in a theater, and there's a scene in the movie where like the government officials have come and taken over their house, and they have this plastic tubing, and it's like really weird and scary in their house. And I remember being a kid and thinking to myself, like, I don't like this. This movie is trying to make me feel bad and upset, and I don't like it. And like, I
Mm.
it's not. I don't. In my mind, I always laugh and think like, oh, look, he was a critic even when he was a little kid. But then, I think in part, there's is this sort of like somewhat mechanical quality sometimes to Spielberg's work that like you can see the machinery working, and so that even as like a little kid, you can sort of like tell, you can feel like what the movie wants to do and how it's sort of like working on you. And so like I do have a weird relationship to ET because of that. I think my personal fave is Raiders of the Lost Ark. What about you, Mary? Do you have what would you say is your favorite
Oh,
Spielberg movie?
I think we are having a little technical difficulties. So Mary had to. I think she's recharging. So she'll join us in a second.
Oh, okay, okay, sorry.
We'll carry this for a little bit more, Mark. But
Oh, sure, sorry.
and no, not at all. Please, these things happen. But I will answer your question. I think in terms of just pure craftsmanship, I think Jaws is really just the one that just has the greatest effect on me. But I have to say it's funny. I'm not putting this forward as my favorite Spielberg at all because I don't think it's anywhere near his best. But it was actually in this week's Showdown, so I'm going to mention it. And it's actually War of the Worlds, weirdly. And it's funny. It was his 2005 one, which most people would not put that anywhere near the apex of his work. And it was up against AI, actually, which most cinephiles certainly would regard as a better film. And I'm not disagreeing with them, but I remember watching War of the Worlds in 2005 in theaters by myself on a summer day. It was probably this day 15 years ago. And feeling just a level of despair that I have not felt all that often in mainstream blockbusters since then. I felt like that movie to me channeled a kind of post 9/11 terror and anxiety. I don't even know what it would be like watching that movie again now in the pandemic, but and I don't know what it was because it's like I've seen disaster movies, I've seen action movies, I've seen Tom Cruise movies, I've seen family in peril movies, but that was just a weird case, and I don't know if it was the mood I was in or what.
No, I think you're totally right because it's
Yeah,
funny that War of the Worlds has been on cable recently. So like more than once, I've been like flipping channels and found myself just completely sucked in to that
yeah,
movie. And I think it obviously was made with sort of a post 9/11 mood, and I think that the fact that it's a somewhat moodier Tom Cruise performance makes the movie unusual. This is maybe going to sound funny. Dakota Fanning's performance in that movie, and she is a very young girl there,
that's right.
is really terrific, and she really like emotionally grounds that movie, and the fear that she conveys is so palpable that it just creates this really sort of like feeling of anxiety. You want to protect that young girl. You're feeling the same things that she's feeling. She sort of becomes like a conduit for the audience in a way, and I think it does. It's funny. Spielberg's made so many movies; it is hard to like keep them all straight. And so I don't know if that's kind of where this somewhat darker turn in his recent work happened, but I think it definitely is like an exemplar of that for sure. But yeah, it's funny. I think, and this is the thing about Spielberg is that because he just keeps working. It's kind of easy sometimes to overlook them film to film. So a movie like War of the Worlds, and there's obviously a lot that happened when that movie was coming out. That it's easy to overlook them sometimes, and then you come back to them later and realize how terrific they are. Like each individual film really is.
Absolutely. And it's worth noting, his just how prolific he is. And, people think about the 1993 year when he gave us Jurassic Park and Schindler's List, which seemed to encompass perhaps the complete polar extremes of what he is capable of doing. And War of the Worlds came out the same year as Munich, which is another one of my favorite kind of, I guess, mid-late Spielberg movies. And both of those movies are just incredibly despairing. One is an action, a dystopian kind of action flick that is meant to be escapist and doesn't feel escapist at all. And the other one, of course, is about the Israeli-Palestinian crisis and explores that in a very thoughtful and trenchant and philosophical way. I mean, really.
But also is this, Munich is this also a very exciting sort of 70s style Euro thriller. Like it obviously is
Yeah.
sort of influenced by Day of the Jackal. I think some of the 70s sort of action work of say like John Frankenheimer. Like there's something just so exciting about Munich, even as it's such a, there's a certain hopelessness to that movie. Like there is a
Yeah.
lot of despair in that movie. And yet it still has this really exciting, sort of French Connection style energy to it.
Yeah. I haven't seen either of those since 2005, and I am very excited to do that now. So I think we have Mary back, right? Can we bring her back on? Hi.
Hey, there you are.
Yeah,
Welcome
I
back.
think a shark ate my computer or something. I don't know. My computer just shut down. It was very scary. And I come
It's
back and you're
fine.
talking about Munich. Did we miss Indiana Jones?
No, actually, and in fact, I should move us over to there now since we
Yeah.
only have about 15, 20 minutes left. And Mark, you were just saying how I'm very pleased by your answer. Raiders of the Lost Ark is maybe the Spielberg movie that means the most to you. Tell us about when you first saw it.
Well, I would have seen it at the Oak Park Mall multiplex in Overland Park, Kansas, and I think it's funny when I rewatched the movie recently. I was so struck by the fact that I think when I saw that when I was a kid, you just kind of assumed all movies were going to be like that. That like they were going to be that sort of like perfectly crafted, that sort of like witty and just full of excitement and fun, and parenthetically, when talking about Indiana Jones, you have to overlook the fact that he's, profiteering by stealing from indigenous peoples around the world. But, what are you going to do? And so then, I just think there's something, and the fact that, George Lucas and Steven Spielberg very specifically wanted to make this movie that reminded them of movies they had seen as kids. So they wanted to make this kind of perfect object. And I think in some ways they did that. It's just a movie that's just motored by like joy and fun and just like a movie-ish excitement.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. I mean, that exactly as you say, Spielberg and Lucas wanting to recapture the energy and invention of the adventure serials that they so loved in their youth, and of course that informed Star Wars, taking these adventures and executing them on the grandest possible scale. And it's funny, these movies, watching Raiders of the Lost Ark again, it's like these enthusiasms are not necessarily my enthusiasms, but I feel like they become mine for 2 hours anyways. And Mary, when was your first time, if you remember, seeing Raiders of the Lost Ark or Indiana Jones for the first time? And do you have any fondness for these movies? I mean, do they mean the same?
Oh my God, I love these movies. And of course, we were all in love with Harrison Ford. I mean, that was, with the hat and the whip and the scene where he pulls out the gun. And also Karen Allen, who was actually, even though she was
Yes.
forced to spend half the movie in a negligee back when the days when women had to be in a negligee, but she at least was like kind of, his equal and did things and, picked up the gun and, wasn't a shrinking violet. So that was really great. But no, it was just so, I mean, it had everything, right? I mean, it had archaeology and, handsome guys and Nazis whose faces melted, which is what you wanted to have happen to all Nazis forever. And, the Ark of the Covenant. And it was kind of, it had every single thing that you could possibly have. And it's also important. I was thinking when you were talking about how Jaws launched the summer movie, it also launched, if in my memory, we saw a lot of movies about sharks like Blue Water, White Death, and all of these terrible
Yes.
shark movies. But then it also like got into like, there were, the Incan, the circles and there was a lot of mystical movies. What was it called? I can't remember. There was a big book that was out and they did all these movies about, the pyramids and, did aliens create these big, the Easter Island statues and all of that stuff? And those were all in the theaters too. And so Indiana Jones comes along and it sort of like taps into that as well, which is like kind of the history, mystical um, uh, fascinations that we all have, and did it in this way that was just like, nonstop action with these very fun and the bantering and the little monkey who dies because he eats the date. I mean, it's just like all these wonderful little moments that really lifted out of like sort of a comic book adventure tale. um
Yeah.
but just we all want to believe that somewhere there's a warehouse. And in fact, they made a television show much, much later, Warehouse 13, which I loved, where all of these like weird, Area 53, where all these weird, inexplicable, mystical, magical, alien things exist. And so I think that sort of played into that too. But it was Harrison Ford. I mean, he was just adorable. I mean, like the most handsome man anybody'd ever seen on in the movies, and we all wanted to date him or be him or just hang out with him. It was Indiana Jones was great. And I want to say one more thing, which is you said it was the best in the canon, and obviously it is, but I love the one with Sean Connery and the name, where they're after the
Last Crusade.
Grail.
Yeah,
Is the Last Crusade. Thank you.
that's right. Yeah.
That to me was I love that one even more because Sean Connery's in it and he's sort of doing this, like this twinkle in his eye, doing the kind of I'm not the hero in this one, even though I'm Sean Connery. I love
Well, it's
it.
so interesting how with this, the second movie, they leaned harder into sort of like action and going so far as to be a bit gory and also the sort of occult aspects of it. But then with the third movie, they sort of went back the other way and they made a movie that was much funnier and the one that's almost like the most pure comedy of the series.
Yeah, and I think that was, the banter was so important. And I think, we saw that in Jaws too. And in almost all of Spielberg's movies, it's like, the most important thing when you're creating these universes in which these extraordinary things happen is you have to create characters and situations that the audience recognizes and attaches to, and so that when the extraordinary things happen they buy into them. And one of the best ways to do that is by having these really charming characters who are like sort of funny and teasing each other, and whether it's a love situation or just friends, it's like you recognize instantly that kind of chemistry between friends or between colleagues or whatever, and so then you're in for the whole ride. And those movies did that. Those two movies did it really well, I thought.
I think it's
Right.
very perceptive because I think a lot of Spielberg's movies from this period are comedies. I think, E.T. is a comedy. Close Encounters is a comedy at heart, sort of beneath maybe the generic trappings and tropes and the visual and whatever special or visual effects. Um, Jaws is a comedy as well. I mean, for the reasons you state, and it's also worth noting, even Quint's death scene is horrifying and tragic. It's also kind of funny. I mean, that's the joke that he plays on the audience. I mean, it's horrifying more than it is anything else. But I think there is a sick, you laugh. How many times do you laugh and scream at the same time when you're watching that film? And with Raiders as well, it's just there's a nonstop action and comedy momentum to this movie. It's very funny too because I think it's the sort of emulsion of action and comedy it's a blend that Hollywood has struggled to do as well. I think when you have these movies billed as action comedies and it feels like it's like oil and water. Those two sides of it are fighting each other, and not so with this one. And to go to something Mary was saying too, this is a movie in which Nazis are the villains, and it's a movie in which an Old Testament God brings about the sort of Deus ex machina at the end. And this is a movie where Spielberg is taking on things like as weighty as Nazism and religion and the history of the earth, and dealing with them in a way that is so irreverent that almost, if the movie weren't so fun, would give you pause. And it's interesting now because as we look back at Indiana Jones through the prism of, I guess, the 21st century, and even as a new Indiana Jones is in the works, even as we speak, I think people are maybe more critical of these movies now, like in terms of is it wrong to? I mean, I don't think it's wrong to punch Nazis, and it's as this movie tells you, it's absolutely okay, and in fact should be done. But you talk about the racial representations in these movies. Sometimes it does feel like a product of a more innocent, earnest, irreverent era. I don't know what you guys think about that and how well these movies have aged in that respect.
Well, it was also, a very, white male centric movie. And yes, and the few people of color who were in it were either running away, they were scared, or they were just non-characters. Although I will say Indiana Jones, they made a big point that yes, he was taking these things from their native lands, but he was going to put them in a museum. That was like the big thing. He wasn't going to like keep them for his private collection, like his the French guy who was his nemesis or whatever was just going to keep them. So there was at least some sort of professional noble cause or whatever. He taught at Harvard, I believe. It's like that was his grounding. But yeah, I think also when you were talking about like the how funny they were, I mean, these are also movies that like had these one-liners that just entered, I mean, you got to get a bigger boat is like that is still like, shorthand for, I guess it's well, is it you got to get we need to get a bigger boat.
You're going to need a bigger boat. Yeah.
We're going to need a bigger boat. And I mean, it's like these kind of like these beautiful kind of, it had to be snakes, when Indiana Jones is looking down into the thing. It's like these moments that just sort of imprint on you. And that I know from going to the movies with my own kids, it's like they will put up with a lot if they can walk out of the theater with like two really good lines, because that encapsulate for them some situation that they recognize, and that's what these movies did that in spades. Spielberg was great at that.
Was. Oh, I think we are about to wrap up pretty soon. I think we have two more questions. One of them comes from one of our readers. So let me see if we can pull up that question on the screen. Yes, from Hasmik, who I must say I believe has been following the Ultimate Summer Movie Showdown extremely closely. One of our biggest followers. Why do you think both Raiders of the Lost Ark and Jaws have endured for 3 generations? Gen X, Millennial, Gen Z. I've never thought about delineating the unique appeal of that movie perhaps to three different generations, but I know we've been talking about why these movies endure so much, but does anyone want to tackle that one?
Well, I think it's what we've
They're
been
both very
talking
different.
about. It's the fact that the movies, for example, with Jaws, there's something so simple about it that it can speak to different generations at different times. Like because it both like is a movie that sort of like has no message and has a lot of messages to it that I think that makes it very enduring and malleable. That it can become like a pandemic movie, although I don't know that anybody ever thought of it that way, before. And then I think with Raiders, there is something just so pure in its essence. I mean, the fact that like it's very clear who the bad guys are in Raiders of the Lost Ark, and it's very clear like what they're trying to accomplish. And so I think that those things about that movie help make it really enduring. It's just they both have something, just a straightforward quality that like makes them just last and last.
And they're action packed, but they don't assault your senses. They don't, it's like not a million car chases and not a million, shoot 'em ups and not huge cities being destroyed all the time. And they're, they're easy to watch. I mean, well, Jaws isn't easy to watch because it's still very tense, even though everything. But Raiders of the Lost Ark is just a pleasure to watch. You feel enough and you're excited, but you don't have to, you're not really worried. He's gonna save the day. Like you knew it going in. There's nothing better than seeing, Nazis have their faces melt off or like just really, just disappear into the ethers. And it was also in that particular case, I mean, the whole cult of the supernatural was actually something that the Nazis were into. So it wasn't even like they were sort of, well, we need this to be Nazis, so we're going to just shove the Nazis in here. I mean, like that actually could have happened. There were, Hitler wanted the Ark of the Covenant because he thought he could get it. And so that was kind of cool, knowing that it was actually kind of real, and it also went to cool places. But the characters, it all comes down to the characters. The characters are timeless. They're people that we recognize today for better and worse. In the case of Jaws, the adventurer and the adventuresome girlfriend, and all of that. I mean, it just doesn't feel dated, except for, as you say, all white. The casting could, there's no reason why the casting couldn't have been more diverse, but that was not, being discussed, unfortunately, at that
Yeah.
time.
I think it's going to be very interesting to see this Indiana Jones 5 and what comes of it, which Spielberg, of course, is not directing himself, but which just the representations of that movie are going to be interesting to see, because I think it does present a challenge in terms of being faithful to the original sensibility, while perhaps also updating it. I don't know what they plan to do. And it's worth noting, too, that sensibility in ways that maybe seem less enlightened now were themselves part of those serials that Spielberg and Lucas were paying tribute to. So and of course, when you are paying homage to something or paying tribute, you will reshape things. And the era in which you are making it will influence it. So I think that it's going to be interesting to see what comes of that movie whenever we see it, when movies are back in theaters, because I don't think we're going to get that a link to that one to watch it on our home TVs. And then our last question, we'll end with this. This comes from our LA Times Book Club editor, Donna Wares, who is wonderful and has been instrumental in helping produce these shows every week. Jaws is based on Peter Benchley's book. What else are you enjoying for summer reading? Yes, we have a book question, because we are literate people, not just sin-illiterate people. But what have you guys been reading, if anything?
Well, I'm always reading Agatha Christie at any given time. And I actually just finished, which I'd never read, some of her novels that she wrote under a different name, which is escaping me now, which is terrible. But there was this one novella in it that I need to research, because it seems to explain what happened to her when she went missing for those famous 13 days when Agatha Christie went missing. Okay, so I'm reading that.
One. Yeah.
And I'm also I'm reading P.D. James, because I love P.D. James. And my son and I just finished watching all of the Lord of the Rings, because that is something we do on a regular basis. And so now I'm reading the entire Lord of the Rings, the big red, the whole, the big fancy one. I decided.
Okay. I need to hijack this for a second, because Mary, you could not have planned a better answer, because I did not know you were an Agatha Christie obsessive. And also, I have to do this really fast. I have to just, this is my P. James hardcover collection on my shelf behind me. Sorry, I just had to do that. I love her. So anyways.
Oh, wait. Let me show you. Here's my Agatha Christie. Here are my Agatha Christie's.
Oh my gosh, you have all those leather-bound editions.
I have the black ones.
I've read so many in those leather. Okay, yeah.
Well. And I have like half of them also in paperback. It's terrible. And every once in a while, I will find one in a used bookstore that I haven't read, and it's like Christmas, because
oh my God, I love just buying Agatha Christie paperbacks for like a dime, or I used to love doing that. No.
Yeah, no.
Well, also just with all the different covers, like the different eras of covers.
Oh, I know. Some of them are amazing. And I have some that I'm just keeping because of that, and like that were 59 cents or something. It's like insane. But yeah, it's like it's, when you're anxious all the time, not that I'm anxious all the time. There is nothing more soothing for me than to read an Agatha Christie, because it's just, you're in a master's hands and you don't have to worry.
It's funny, I'm very excited. I just taped off of Turner Classics a movie called The Alphabet Murders, where Tony Randall plays Hercule Poirot. Like,
oh my God, I never saw that one.
I have never seen this movie. I'm very excited to see this movie.
John Malkovich just did that, The Alphabet Murders. I forget who he did it for. I can't remember. I'm gonna mess that up. But it was a really interesting interpretation of Hercule Poirot. I'm not sure that I was a huge fan, but I give him credit for trying something different. And of course, Kenneth Branagh, who I thought would be a terrible Hercule Poirot, turned out to be a pretty good one.
It was really good.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to the next one. Which one is it?
Death on the Nile.
Death on the Nile.
Death on the Nile, which is one of my favorite of hers. But no, he's a pretty good Poirot.
And that movie, the original one with like Maggie Smith, that was like kind of before the Love Boat. There was Death on the Nile. It's like, let's just
And
assemble all of these stars.
oh my gosh. And Angela Lansbury
And Angela Lansbury, yes.
and Mia Farrow. Yeah, no, exactly. Okay, we clearly need to do an Agatha Christie episode.
Yes.
This is all over.
I'm
I'm going to talk to you offline about that, Mary. But Mark, I know we could probably go for another hour. Mark, what are you reading at the moment?
I currently am reading the book called The Big Goodbye, Chinatown in the Last Years of Hollywood by Sam Wasson. It's about the making of the movie Chinatown. As Sam Wasson, the author, wrote the book on Bob Fosse that was the basis for the recent miniseries about him, Fosse Verdon. And so this has just been kind of a really sort of like kind of gripping look at like the making of that movie and placing it sort of culturally within the moment of Hollywood in the 70s, as we've been talking about today with Jones.
That's fantastic, and I need to read more film books myself, and this is a good time to do that. I am at the moment, however, very distracted, reading my own not a British mystery novel, an American mystery novel, Ross MacDonald's The Chill. I've been meaning to try to get into Ross MacDonald forever, and I'm very much enjoying that. So this has been a fabulous conversation. Thank you so much, Mary and Mark, for joining us. And I want to give, of course, our viewers a little sneak preview of what lies ahead for next week. This will be, week 9, with the voting that just finished this week. The polls close this afternoon. Here are the movies that were up for the winner of this week. It was such a good week that we went to 24 movies, because how could you leave out The Devil Wears Prada, Spider-Man 2, AI, South Park, Bigger, Longer, and Uncut, WALL-E. And WALL-E was one of our 3 finalists. It was WALL-E, A League of Their Own, and Do the Right Thing. Very exciting vote off between this top trio. In the end, the voting was not close. You voted for Spike Lee's 1989 masterpiece, Do the Right Thing. And I think it's as good a choice as you have made this entire series, which turns 9 next week. And we will be back here next week to talk about all things Do the Right Thing. So, yeah. Thank you, Mary and Mark, again. And
thank you.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. So I will bid you adieu and say good night to our audience. Good night.
Good night.
Bye.